Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to our session on AI governance, standardization and certification. My name is Sebastian Hallensleben. I'm chairing European AI standardization. I'm also chairing some work at the OECD, and I'm the head of digitalization at VDE. When we talk about AI governance, we're really talking about what do we want. AI is not something that happens to us like the weather or a volcanic eruption. AI is something that we shape, that allows us to make decisions on how we would like to handle AI. And AI governance, if you like, is the science of how to shape AI, or the practice of how to shape AI. It's not easy. We are talking about the cutting edge technologically. We're also talking about the cutting edge from a societal perspective, with different difficult discussions to be had about acceptable risks, about safety, about fundamental rights. When we talk about standardization and certification, we talk about ways to help us implement AI governance, to put AI governance into practice. So in today's session, we will put insights and thoughts around this area. And I'm very, very pleased to be able to present to you, first of all, Gary Marcus, who is the professor of psychology and neuroscience at New York University and also an entrepreneur. Laure Willemin, the head of data science at Swisscom. I'm also very pleased that we are joined by Sergio Mujica, the Secretary General at ISO.
Pronunciation.
I did practice. And we are also very, very pleased to have Andrew Ng among us. I've already noticed on the way in that he's being mobbed by almost everyone. He's, of course, the founder of Landing AI. He's also the founder of DeepLearning.AI and the managing general partner at the AI Fund. And last but not least, Franziska Weindauer, the CEO at TÜV AI.Lab, who will be co-moderating the panel with me. I'd like to hand over to you, Franziska.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I'm really glad we can have this discussion on Monday night to kick off the Davos AI House. And I would like to add a different and an additional perspective to the one you just offered, and acknowledge the crowd we have here today, which is great because it's very international and global. And I think we should also incorporate this global perspective on the panel, because it's really important to look at AI from a global perspective, because the splinter net, as we know it very well by now for a couple of decades, that also expands into the AI space. And I think it's really important to shape and come together to have a global dialogue on AI, because having different perspectives, different regulations, different ideas of what ethical means, of what fair means in the world, that makes it really difficult, for example, for global companies to operate internationally, to take up all these different perspectives. And we'll have an industry perspective here today, who will talk more about that. But I would like to start off the discussion by talking a bit about governance of AI. And Gary, I would like to ask you, what's your view on governing AI? How do we approach the subject? What are the issues we need to take into account? Can you please guide us a bit with your
You told me I only have 3 minutes, and I
I know it's a very broad question.
So I'll just say a couple things. One is it's actually in the interest of companies to have some kind of standards here. We don't want to train a different large language model for each company for each country. Just the damage to our climate alone would probably be serious. We would like to have some common practice that everybody could follow. The second thing I'll say is that I think every country should have its own AI agency, where it is somebody's full-time job with staff and so forth to track both the positive uses of AI and how governments can be improved and so forth, and also the downside risks. A third thing is we need to think a lot about the negative externalities. So, for example, if AI is used a lot for misinformation, who's responsible for that? If we use open source, how are we going to track down if something needs to be fixed? So there are a lot of questions like that I think that we need to figure out. And the last thing I'll say is there's not one problem, not one risk that we're mitigating against. There are many different risks. Some are short-term, some are long-term. Sometimes I see the field kind of argue within itself, and they're like, my problem is more important than your problem. And I get really upset at that, because I think there are actually lots of things that we need to worry about, like misinformation now. And people could argue about the long-term runaway AI risk. I don't think the species is ever going to be extinct. I think we're not anytime soon. We're pretty resilient. But there are scenarios where we don't have very good control of AI. We don't have very good control of large language models. We're giving them more power. We're going to have more powerful AI systems that are more empowered to do things in the world. We need to think about the short-term risk and the long-term risk. So it's a mistake to think there's one magic bullet here. We're going to need many different approaches. And we're going to need layered oversight and so forth.
Great. That was really short. Thank you.
And with this overarching introduction, this also sets the scene to drill a little bit deeper into specific perspectives. And I'd like to turn to you and ask you to comment from a perspective of a technology company that's been around for 25 years, that is not old, but established and almost traditional. If you comment from the Swisscom perspective, what are the needs that you have as a company with regards to AI governance, and what would you like to see in that context?
Thank you very much. And I'm honored and pleased to be here. So for the perspective, first of all, Swisscom is a bit older than that because we grew from another company. But for us, the most important thing is that we are a trustworthy company, and trust is the most important thing that we have to our customers, that we can deliver value. And so if we want to maintain and not jeopardize now this trustness we have in the market, which is bringing out new AI technologies where suddenly we see, okay, that wasn't good. So therefore, I want to bring 3 points. So to not jeopardize, we need legal certainty what we're doing. So right now we don't have this. So if we want to do AI, right now for us it's difficult because what is normal and what not, to have really this legal certainty what we're doing. Not that someday suddenly the people are saying, hey, what you did was not good. So this is one point why I believe that we need regulation in a certain form. But the other point is, when I think about regulation, is we have dealt quite a lot in the past with regulation, and for me, especially, I'm also dealing with the whole data platform. For me, GDPR is one of the aspects I still have and we're still dealing with. It's super hard to implement. So if we look having some sort of standardization regulation, it needs to be easy and doable to implement. And then think of just GDPR, the rule to have things forgotten. Now we're doing AI. In my model, what do we do and how do we interpret now this law which we have in the AI world? What do I do with this model? Do I need to retrain those? I can't always retrain just because one customer wanted to delete their things in it. So there comes in with quite a lot of complex things. So what I need from the industry is we need regulation, but they need to be doable and implementable in an easy way. And the third point is what I really need is also that we have open innovation, so that we don't jeopardize with too many rules the innovation part, that it's this balance. And the point is it will be quite hard as we need a lot of discussion. It's not just about the technical interoperability that we want to have here, which normally I learned, or for me that was standardization. In the AI world, it's most of the times it's another topic that we need to look at. So yes, that's from my point of view in short.
Thanks. Andrew, we'll move over to you, and you represent, so to say, a newer industry as a serial entrepreneur. You founded several companies in the last decade or so, I would say, maybe even more. What's your perspective on AI governance? What do you and your companies need from regulators and others?
Yeah, so, well, maybe think about what the AI community could do for the world. I think at this moment in time, we're at significantly greater risk of over-regulating than under-regulating. One of the tricky things to understand about AI is it's a general purpose technology, meaning it's not useful for one thing, it's useful for a lot of different applications. Kind of like electricity. If I ask you what is electricity good for, it's almost hard to answer because it's so pervasive. And AI as a technology is making its way into healthcare, financial services, self-driving cars, online education, on and on and on. And I feel like Europe and sometimes the US has spoken about a tiered risk approach to AI. That's a good idea. That actually makes sense. But to me, medical device is more risky than some innocuous website that just, I don't know, some innocuous thing that's not a medical device. So that makes sense. And I think that a social media company that touches 100 million users, that's more risky than a small startup with a website with just 100 users. If you have 100 million users, risk of disinformation, misinformation is much higher. And I see regulators in both the United States, or spending some time the US Senate and so on, and as well as in Europe, is making a significant mistake, is saying that more powerful, bigger AI models are more risky. And because it turns out if you regulate the AI technology layer, you slow down AI development, and that subsequently hurts all of the applications to which we could be applying this. So I feel like regulators, if we look at the applications, figure out what are the concrete risks. Medical device, we want that to be safe. Self-driving car, we want that to be safe. If you want to write underwriting software to decide whether or not to make loans, we want that to be reasonably fair and unbiased. And I think that certainly in the US, and I suspect in Europe too, I've been seeing the, I don't know, it feels like hundreds of millions of dollars backed by lobbyists, lobbying governments to pass candidly stifling regulation that will make it really difficult for open source contributors because frankly, the companies would rather not have to compete with open source software. And if the lobbyists and the big tech lobbying for this has their way, it will stifle innovation in the United States and in Europe. And I see that as a material risk. And by the way, I see my old friend Bernard Shokov here. Frankly, if you want to pass laws to fund great research, give lots of money to great research. That will accelerate European innovation. But I'm actually very worried that a lot of regulatory regimes in the US and Europe will stifle global innovation much more than bring benefits or protect people.
To make that not happen, one of the ways of bridging regulation and practice of helping companies along in that is standardization, I guess, because it tells us how to interpret the regulation. Sergio, could you please perhaps take us to the ISO perspective, to the global perspective on standards? How are they being developed? What AI issues are being covered? Where do we still see holes in the system? Which issues do we need to focus on?
Okay, I'll try to respect the 3-4 minutes for that. First of all, I don't think I need to spend that much time in convincing everyone that standards are of the essence to address the challenges and opportunities of AI that has been stressed by the G7, by the OECD, G20, and lately by the high-level expert group created by the UN Secretary General. That's number one. Number two, I think international standards are instrumental to implement policy and regulations. So we do not compete with policymakers. We're here to help and to accelerate and to better understand what is in that regulation and to provide the how to the industry. I know that is very important to you, to provide the how to implement that regulation. So how can we help? This is the key question. ISO represent 170 countries involved in the creation of these new standards. So two key elements. First, with the platform. We need to have there the right experts that are appointed by the ISO members. I do not select the expert from Geneva. Each of the ISO members tell me what are the experts that want to be and should be on the table. And then with the due process, we do not impose decisions. All decisions are made by consensus. So imagine the best minds trying to agree on what is the best way of creating a product, doing a process, and so on. Second, full transparency. This has been stressed many, many times as an essential element that should be present in standards related to AI. Then inclusiveness. Everybody is invited to be in the table, even those who disagree with us. And finally, developing countries. It's not only opening the door for developing countries to participate, it's enabling, ensuring right participation by developing countries in the creation of new standards, so everybody's voice is heard. So that's the platform, and we believe that brings trust and credibility to the standards. What is it in the portfolio? And that's the third and last element I wanted to share with you. We are not starting from scratch. We have a dedicated technical committee created in the year 2017. It's a joint committee with our sister organization, the IEC, the Electrotechnical Commission. And what have we done? First, we have a set of standards, so-called foundational standards, where we address definitions, terminology, and also the basic architecture for AI. Second, the trustworthiness, as you mentioned. We refer to ethics, bias, and also a very important element here is risk management. We have a full ISO standard of risk management, but we have a dedicated element about AI, because risk management will or should lead also regulation, because the level of regulation or detail also depends on the level of risk that we're trying to address. And finally, in December, only in December, we launched the very first international standard on management on AI, that will help organizations to implement the regulations, the policies by policymakers throughout a comprehensive framework that will address what is need to be done by the company, by the leaders, by the decision makers, who does what, roles and responsibilities, and so on.
Perfect. Thank you. So much for the international perspective. Now we're moving to the European perspective. Sebastian, you're involved at Sensenelec and chairing the AI committee there. Can you tell us what is necessary to be able to implement the AI Act? What is the European Commission asked for? What's the time frame? And how much can you take over from ISO and IEC? And how much original standardization work is necessary?
So Sergio has already made a very strong case for AI standardization per se, so I will go mainly on the European specificities. In Europe, we have a special synergy between regulation and standardization. Regulation sets the overall objectives. Standardization tells us how to reach those objectives. And this has been codified in the so-called new legislative framework, which is a lie in itself. It's not new, it's about 40 years old, but it has stood the test of time. And if the AI Act, for example, specifies or demands transparency, it doesn't really say what transparency is or how to achieve it. This is the role of standards. And a subset of European standards, the so-called harmonized standards, will be published by the European Commission alongside the AI Act. And whoever follows their standards is presumed to be in compliance with the AI Act as well. So most organizations in Europe will not even look at the AI Act in detail and try to understand what it means for them. They will look at harmonized standards, and those will be their practical yardstick for becoming compliant. So wherever there is international work available, it would be foolish to reinvent the wheel in Europe. So we're very, very happily adopting or adapting international work. There are certain aspects that are Europe-specific in the same way as the AI Act is Europe-specific, and many of those aspects are requested specifically by the European Commission, a so-called standardization request, which is essentially a shopping list or a list of requirements that the European policymakers give to standardizers and say, can you please create standards for transparency, for record keeping, for bias, for security, and so on. And it's then up to the community, self-organized, as Sergio mentioned, for the international community as well, to see, well, how can we satisfy that? How can we structure it? Work is well underway. The clock is ticking because the AI Act will take effect in early 2026. And before that time, all those standards need to be ready so companies have got a chance to implement them. And Franziska, because you asked a question to me, I'll turn the tables and ask a question to you, because you are the specialist on certification, and it would be great if you could comment on the role of certification, what it can and what it cannot, what it can and cannot do, and how it's going to work in this context.
Thank you, Sebastian. Yeah, just to lay the ground here, what certification actually is. I mean, it has been around for ages as well. The TÜV, TÜV, my mother organization, they've started certifying products when the steam boilers were invented, which is quite a while ago, 150 years ago, about 150 years ago, yeah. And they, what certification actually actually does is that independent organizations notified third parties, which are being notified by an organization appointed by the government, and they look at the products and assess whether they are compliant with the regulation and the standards. And if so, they get, for example, a CE mark. And in the AI space, this is so much more difficult than in a steam boiler or a train or elevator, because for example in an elevator you could calculate the likelihood of the system failing. You can calculate the material inability. You can look at the metal strings that hold up the elevator cabin, and you can say, oh, this is this material and so much weight is going to come on there every day, and this is the likelihood of the material deteriorating, so we need to change the metal strings every 20 years or so before they break. And this is of course so much more difficult with AI, because you can't calculate these possibilities of failure, right? Because an AI system has endless possibilities of responding to something, and so you can't calculate how likely it is to make a mistake, and that's the essential approach that certification organizations usually take, and usually they assess functional safety, which is the main thing in the testing business is functional safety, and that's much more difficult for an AI application. So what we need to do is to look at what benchmarks AI models actually need to comply with, and we need to also as a society agree on things like how good does the AI system actually have to be, right? Does it have to be better than a human, or does it have to be as good as a human or worse? Right? What's the benchmark? If a self-driving car, does the algorithm have to be better as a driver who might be drunk driving, or is it okay, right? And I think as a society, we at the moment, at least if I'm following the political discussions, right, I think we always have higher expectations of an AI than we have of humans. So the AI needs to be better than we are collectively. So right, so this is what the effort we need to do. We need to translate the standards into quantifiable conformity criteria, and then we need to come up with test methods and processes, which is for generative AI models is really difficult because assessing explainability of ChatGPT isn't easy, and benchmarking it is even more difficult. So that's the task we have to do as TÜV AI.Lab in the next years, also to be able to certify companies, because there are areas where certification is mandatory in Europe and will be also according to the AI Act, is already with, for example, medical AI applications. They need to be certified to enter the market. So that's already status quo. So we need to be quick in coming up with these procedures.
Can I add something to that? So,
sure.
Two case studies. So the CE mark is actually an interesting example. When you buy a toaster oven and you plug it into electric mains, we don't want it to electrocute, right, someone. So it's actually kind of good that there is a CE mark. So that's good, because the toaster oven is an application with a real risk of electrocuting people or generating electrical interference. And so the CE certification, it seems like a reasonable certification. The flip side, just so we're aware, the CE mark makes it much harder for new entrants to invent and build new electrical appliances. This actually raises the cost significantly for startups. So there is a price to pay, but it kind of may be reasonable that now we don't get electrocuted. I want to tell you a quick story. A few years ago, this was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I was sitting down with one of the executives of one of the very large American tech companies. I'm not going to say which one. But he was telling me about how this particular because he was in charge of it, of what I'm about to say. His CEO had asked him to figure out how to comply with GDPR. And he said, basically, yep, we can respect customer privacy, fully comply with GDPR, set a really complicated structure. And when we do this, no one will be able to compete with us because it's so darn complicated. No startup will ever be able to do this. So there's specific regulatory capture attempt to use GDPR to shut out small competitors. So there's a real price to pay when we put in place these types of regulations. So as you standardize and as you put in place certifications, I would respectfully suggest think about the concrete harms. If AI isn't explainable, where is it harmful? Sometimes it is. I think when you try to make applications safe, we can have a rational conversation about what are the actual risks and certify, regulate, standardize. When you think about the technology layer, I think most attempts to regulate or certify or standardize that will have a much more stifling effect on innovation than an actual consumer protecting effect.
And just to pick up on it's actually very instructive to compare the GDPR with the AI Act. With the GDPR, there is only the regulation. and everyone was trying to make sense of it, and there are a gazillion different interpretations of GDPR. With the AI Act, we're going to have harmonized standards, so there is much, much less room for doubts on how to interpret it and how to apply it. And from my perspective, standards are a way of not repeating this big mistake, if you like, that was made with GDPR. And we're in an excellent situation because everyone's been so concise. We have a substantial amount of time left to open up the discussion to the room. And I'd like to invite you to ask your questions, be as brief as possible, and we'll maybe collect 2 or 3 questions and then put them to the people on the panel.
Got one.
And Franziska is just picking up a microphone.
Okay, we don't have a microphone, so please just be really loud. And we can repeat the question, yes? I think we were first.
Yeah.
Yes, you're.
The mic appeared.
Oh, perfect. Thanks.
So hi, I'm Max, and so far this discussion has been about standardizing AI. And what's been missing for me is kind of how do you even define what is AI and what isn't AI? So I mean, in my understanding, the current AI models are basically a series of matrix multiplications, a lot of them, but that's basically what happens under the hood. So at which point at which number does the number of matrix multiplication become AI that needs to be regulated in this way? And what's sort of the threshold and how to decide exactly where, if I'm building something, does that fall under AI Act or not?
Maybe we take one more question. Do you want to pass the microphone to the back? Yeah, just because it's convenient.
I think you were.
He was first.
Thank you. Oh,
Yeah. We'll pick you up.
my name is Daniel Stauffacher from the ICT for Peace Foundation, and I was intrigued by the very brief mention of the externality cost that we have not been looking at. Could you kindly expand that topic? Because I think something that is missing in this discussion. We have written a paper recently on this, but I would like to hear more from you.
Thank you. Could you pass the microphone to the gentleman in the back? Yeah, thanks.
I had a chance to read ISO 43001, and I noted that there's an absence of an emphasis on safety. Going back to the certification piece, we certify products because we want them to be safe. I found that the ISO 42001 lacked an emphasis on safety as a preeminent concern, and the risk management is actually left up to the organization to determine what is safe or what is appropriate. And it seemed like there was a missed opportunity. So I'm wondering if that was intentional and what was the thinking behind that?
So we've got 3 questions now, one on the AI definition, one on externalities, one on safety in the 42001. Should we do a quick round of answers?
Oh, sure. I guess I can't speak to the European regulations. Hopefully someone else can. You know, the field of AI and machine learning, we've always been very inclusive. So my attitude has been, if you wrote something you want to call it AI, good enough for me. You're one of us. But I know the regulations have a different answer. So someone could speak to, I think there's some computational thresholds. Someone else may be able to speak to that.
I'll answer a couple things. First, just very briefly on the matrix multiply. Obviously, it depends what you're doing. What is the input? What's the output? What is the effect on society? So if you're doing math problems for your linear algebra class, I don't think that counts as AI. I don't think there's any reasonable argument. It's not that you have matrix multiply. It's what you're doing, trying to predict something, trying to control something, affect something in the world, and so forth. The definitions have actually been argued over, and they're complicated, but I think it's more than just what piece of math are you doing. In terms of negative externalities, I would take a step back and look at some historical cases like copyright law. So sometimes the existing law doesn't handle the negative externalities, but we decide as a society we want to do something. So when the printing press was invented, a lot of authors were ripped off. And that's, as I understand it, though I'm not a historian of all this, that's how copyright law came to be, is that authors were getting taken advantage of by printing presses that were just taking their works. I think we have to have a similar mindset now and ask, what is the society that we want? Which I think has to start with human rights and dignity and so forth. I personally would like to see a society in which we continue to have art and writing and so forth. And you'd have to ask the question, if these systems are going to take all of this stuff, A, is it covered by existing copyright law, but B, maybe we want a different kind of law in order to prevent the negative externality of winding up in a world without art and writing. I think you could extend that argument in a number of places. You can also ask about cases like misinformation. What if these systems really do undermine democracy in some serious way? What do we want to do about that? Maybe we have existing laws that do it, but maybe we don't. And we want to ask again, what kind of society do we want, and who should bear the various costs? So I think it's a big, broad question, but it's broader than just what existing law captures something. It's really about what society do we want, and how are we going to think about the next century, and how these things are going to affect everything from employment to democracy and so forth.
I think, yeah, sorry.
Oh, yes, on my side, I listened to the speech from this professor in the morning when the AI house was launched, and he overemphasized how important safety is. So I cannot answer for sure what's the reason why in that standard in particular there is not enough prominence. But it's a very important point that should be taken by the technical committee. Please remember that the technical committee creates standards by consensus, so it's an expert conversation, and each and every one of you has the opportunity to engage with your national standard bodies. Here there are two. Germany and Switzerland present in this very room. You can engage with your national standard body and to have a seat in the table so you can shape that standard and to improve it as we go along. And safety, of course, is an element that should be overemphasized or emphasized more.
And I can maybe add from a European standardization perspective that a similar argument has been put forward by some of the stakeholders in the European arena, and the 42001 will be an important element in European AI standardization, but there will be additional items and additional elements in European standardization that have a slightly deeper or broader emphasis on safety as well, simply because it's a different range of stakeholders.
Okay, I think you were one of the early ones, and you as well. Sorry.
Hi. Hello? Yeah. My question is with regards to certification, actually. And the question is, today we see lots of budding companies, private sector companies, who are coming out and being the certifiers for other companies when it comes to responsible AI or other things like that. I mean, as a user or as a company or even as an individual, how do I know which one is it that I should be really looking at? And my question would very specifically be with regards to the EU and the US. How do you foresee this developing in respect with the AI Act and also with some of the discussions which are happening at the US as well? So thank you.
Thanks. We'll take two more. I don't know who was, I think you were one of the, and you as well. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your great talk. It's very interesting. I'm William from Canada. We hear a lot about the benchmarks of performance of LLM. What do you establish as the current best practice for benchmarks for ethics?
Hi, Gail Trevitz. I'm a professor over at Harvard Medical School, and my kind of question relates to a lot of people are talking about kind of regulation and looking at AI kind of in general, and you gave the analogy right of electricity and so forth. What are your thoughts that eventually it may end up being, or may not be, sector specific, right? Like in electricity, you think, well, electricity has one use, but if it's a hair dryer, you have to be careful with the water, then it has different kind of standards and so forth. And so what is your thinking of kind of the end game of how standards will be at kind of in the long term once we've been able to see the full landscape? I ask kind of from the medical perspective, right? Because we see a lot of issues in the medical space. So will we kind of have medical related standardization or more the AI side?
I'll take a little bit of that. Benchmarks are really hard. There's a history in AI of people making benchmarks that don't really measure what they want them to. The first one and the most famous is the Turing test, was supposed to be a measure of intelligence, but it turns out it can be easily gamed, and it's really a test of human gullibility. You can pass that test without really being particularly intelligent. And that has, I think, haunted the field in the subsequent 60 or 70 years. We don't have too many really good benchmarks for anything. There are lots of benchmarks for language right now, and none of them really seem to get at whether machines fully understand the things that they're reading and so forth. There are benchmarks, for example, on toxicity. Is the output of a large language model toxic or not? And they're mostly made before the GPT-4 era even arrived. They're not really appropriate. There are very few benchmarks that I think are really ready for governance and really ready for mass production. Most of the benchmarks we've ever made can be gamed by looking at little statistical details and things like that. It's very much not a solved science. The only thing I can really say that's not even optimistic but helpful is we need a lot of scientists to be involved in this. If you just leave this to like existing government organizations, they tend to miss important things. I'll give one example and then I'll surrender the microphone, which is in the case of driverless cars, and a really important question that should have been asked, and I know some scientists suggested asking it, but California didn't ask, is how much are these systems using remote operators behind the scenes? So it turns out that Cruise had more people on its remote operations staff than it had driverless cars. And that should change how you evaluate the results. Because you want to know, like, is it worth sacrificing human lives to have these cars on the road? It is worth probably sacrificing some human lives if you can save 30,000 people a year. But if in reality it's all kind of Wizard of Oz and the man behind the curtain is actually controlling the cars or regularly helping with the cars, then you have a different picture about what's going on. But the regulators didn't even think to ask that question. I have a friend who told them to do it and they didn't do it. So we need a lot of scientists involved in formulating the benchmarks. It's very hard work. It's the kind of stuff that peer review was invented for, where somebody makes a proposal and somebody else says, yeah, but have you thought about this other thing? And we need scientists there.
I would quickly like to respond to the ethics and the certification questions. On ethics, I think, I mean, that's super difficult. Take fairness, for example, right? There's so many different interpretations, and what we see at the moment is that you have like 30 plus standardization efforts or models of how to deal with fairness and to define what fairness is and how to make your AI system fair. But then you have to look at the specific context in which you deploy the system, right? Because is equality fair or is equity fair, right? Should the kids with the wealthy parents get the same amount of money or should the poor kids get more money, right? So I think fairness means a lot of things in a lot of different contexts. So what we will need is sort of a map for people, wanting to assess whether their system is fair, saying like a decision tree, saying, you need to take a left here because this is the most important metric you need to look at and so on and so forth. So I think you need to help deciding which fairness model you need to apply. And I think that applies for a lot of ethical questions, not just fairness. And then on certification, I think there's a huge difference between actually certifying something or just testing or assessing something, right? It's always important. Certification is something done by a body which has been notified by an organization to do just that, to certify, to give a CE mark, but not any consulting company can give a CE label, right? So what you say appears now, popping up now, are a lot of companies who do advisory work, yeah? They tell you, this is what you need to do to deploy AI in your organization. And that's great. I think that has to happen a lot, but certification in the end is something different, and then you need to make a difference between, are you a certified AI certified company, or are you just getting advice on how to deploy an AI system in your organization, how to do the governance, how to do the organizational processes, etc. And how to tell whether something is good or not. I mean, I think that's really, really tough. But that's tough in any, how do you decide which clothes company you go to, right? I mean, that's really, I think, really difficult to, and experience will show, I guess, in the end.
But since we're talking about standardization, it's worth highlighting a very nice bridge between ethics and standardization, because you don't associate standardization with ethics usually, but as Sergio mentioned, standardization is consensus building, which gives a lot of legitimacy, and standardization is also the arena where you write down that consensus in a technically useful way. So it's not just the discussion of some panel, but it's you write it down so that a programmer, that a software engineer can actually make use of it. And therefore, standardization is the crucial tool to get AI ethics manageable. The question is then, what do we write into that standard? We're not going to write into it, well, autonomous car, please run over granny, or don't run over the child, or vice versa. But what we can write into standardization is how to describe the ethically relevant characteristics and how to run good processes to arrive at solid ethical decisions. That's what we can standardize, and the other value judgments, they are really for the political arena, not for standardization. And I believe Gary also wanted to make a quick follow-up comment.
Yeah, I wanted to make a shout out in a way. So the subject of innovation came up, and I just want to caution people that large language models have about 98% of the market share right now. It's most of what people talk about when they're talking about AI. It's most of where the money is going. But you have two people in the room, Neil Lawrence and Bernard Scholkoff, who do entirely different things, or at least in part do entirely different approaches, who are here in Europe doing fantastic AI that's on a different axis, or at least some of what they do is on a different axis. And we have to remember, like, we're writing these certifications and so forth around large language models. But large language models have huge problems with factuality and causality is one of the things that Bernard works on. Like, we have to be flexible enough and agile enough to realize AI might actually shift again. Like, we're in our sixth movement of AI, depending on how you count. And it's easy to see the thing you're doing right now and think it's forever. I don't think it's forever.
Perhaps I can try a little bit with your question. It's a tricky one because the beauty of the ISO system is at the same time an issue we need to fix. And let me explain. For 75 years, we've been working in a bottom-up way, meaning that I don't tell you what you need, you tell me what you need. So you propose a new standardization item, and ISO creates a new standard. So you have maturing of new standards from all around the place, and sometimes we lack this comprehensive, transversal framework that will connect the dots. We're working on creating that possibility, so we don't have only sector-specific standards, but also we have those comprehensive frameworks where you can connect the dots.
Perfect. I think we can... sorry, Andrew.
No, this conversation is very interesting. I know this is about government and regulation, but I feel like I want to share with you some of the things happening in AI that you may not be aware of. There is so much going on. We know the large corporates are investing in AI, academic researchers, Neil, Bernard, many others are doing great work in AI. And there are so many people all around the world today just hacking and building AI systems. So maybe some random examples. There are prototypes on the internet where you can call an AI system and instead of responding quickly like an LLM, go and do research on the internet and work for an hour for you and then come back with a report for you. Doesn't work that well, but people are hacking on it. I think last April, there was a research paper out of Google and Stanford, I think, on building something like The Sims. Simulate a bunch of characters in a little village, they chat with each other, they fall in love, they organize a party. It was like a weird video game with people having simulated people having really deep conversations. I have no idea what this is good for. But today, there are many communities, often on Discord, with just individuals, hackers, building these play communities. A lot of this activity happens on Discord, by the way, and a lot of this activity is from builders all around the world, not necessarily affiliated with a big fancy company or a big fancy university. They're just passionate individuals writing code over a weekend. If you look back to the early history of the internet, some of you may remember YouTube was a hotbed of cat videos and copyright violations, right? And it's often this hacker stuff that creates those weird things. And initially, people look at you and go, what is this for? This is ridiculous. You have the established movie industry, then you have this weird website that showed cat videos and copyright violations. How could this ever amount to anything? And it did. And so to me, one question for Europe and US and around the world is, what role do you want to play in this? Yes, absolutely. Safety, regulation, certification, all those things are important. But where is the attention on enabling the builders and encouraging this weird building stuff, hopefully in an ethical way, that could grow up to be the next big tech company? I'll just share with you one other example. This weird builder community, one thing I'm very concerned about is the fake boyfriend and fake girlfriend industry, or the fake partner industry. There are many small startups doing quite well by revenue, millions of annualized run rate kinds of revenue. And many of these companies they're not even pretending to be trying to be ethical. You know, they will use an LLM to build a very weird, very manipulative relationship with people, kind of be a fake boyfriend or girlfriend or other partner, and then monetize that in ways that I personally find very disturbing. I mean, look at these and say, whoa, what are they thinking? They're really kind of, you know, really, I have a line for disgusting. They're definitely well on the other side of that line, some of these websites. Do our regulators know about this? Will we standardize that? So how do we empower the builders and actually look at the weird stuff going on and then steer it toward good? And I would hate to see Europe pass a lot of regulations, and in 10 years from now, you wonder, how come all the big tech companies are still in the US and in Asia? You know, what happened? So how do we unleash and empower and build? And do it in a responsible and safe way. Thank you.
And I hope you don't need to wait for a new regulation to be passed, because the industry and the expert community also can come up with new standards without necessarily having a regulation to implement.
Cedra, I think you at least need to run. You said you need to leave really sharp.
Yeah.
And
I think that Gary had a comment, and we're sort of approaching the end.
Which is, I think regulation and innovation aren't always in conflict, and we want things like seatbelts and catalytic converters where regulation actually motivates something that makes a lot of people safer. So sometimes they're in tension, but sometimes they can actually help.
And just to pick, and I think the point that you made towards the end, Andrew, points to a much broader discussion that we need to have, maybe during the evening, on how we build trust in the digital space and how we go beyond just trying to fix AI risks by regulating AI. We need to think more broadly about how to change the fabric of the digital space. So with this, we have been asked to stick to the time slot allocated. And I'd like to say a very, very big thank you to our panelists. I'd like to say a very big thank you to the audience, to your questions that have really propelled our discussion forward. And I hope we've made a contribution to the discussions that are happening this week in Davos, and wish you good conversations during the evening. Thank you very much.
thank you. Bye.
Thank you.